You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode number 466 of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello, y'all. Thanks for tuning into the podcast.
And thanks for your patience waiting for this show. August has been super busy for us. We'll have had family in one form or another visiting for most of the month. You know how it goes when family is in town.
But with this show, we'll return to the story of the KILPATRIck-DAHLGREN raid and the controversy that ensued afterward regarding the documents found on the body of Colonel Ulrich Dahlgren.
The raid began promisingly enough on the night of February 28, 1864, with Judson Kilpatrick and Dahlgren moving their column of Union horsemen quickly across the Rapidan River, racing past Spotsylvania Courthouse, and splitting up at Mount Pleasant to drive into the heart of central Virginia.
Dahlgren's smaller force sped south, doing damage to the railroad and cutting telegraph lines on February 29th. However, as he neared the James River, Dahlgren lost momentum. His guide, an escaped slave, couldn't find the ford where they planned to cross, and Dahlgren found himself stuck on the north side of the river. Convinced the man had betrayed them, Dahlgren hanged him on the spot.
By dusk, Dahlgren had made his way to within 3 miles of Richmond, but met stiff Confederate resistance. In the darkness and ensuing confusion, Dahlgren and roughly 100 of his men were separated from the rest of his force, most of whom circled north of Richmond, then moved east, hoping to link up with Kilpatrick, who, meanwhile, was experiencing problems of his own.
Kilpatrick reached the outskirts of the Confederate capital as scheduled on March 1st and discovered the approaches were defended more strongly than anticipated. Retreating some distance, he considered a night attack, but rebel cavalry commanded by Wade Hampton caught the Yankees near Atlee's Station and launched an attack.
Kilpatrick's force outnumbered Hampton's, but the hard-charging Confederates' surprise attack threw the Yankees into confusion when it boiled out of the darkness, and Kilpatrick lost his nerve. The following day, Hampton pursued Kilpatrick as he retreated down the peninsula away from Richmond, where Kilpatrick successfully linked up with Union troops from Benjamin Butler's command.
Ulrich Dahlgren had taken a route farther north, crossing the Pamunkey River at Hanovertown, where Confederate Cavalry Lieutenant James Pollard and a detachment of rebel horsemen took up the chase of the Yankee raiders. Circling around Dahlgren near King and Queen Courthouse, Pollard set up an ambush, along with some local home guardsmen.
The Federals stumbled into the ambush about 11 p.m. on the night of March 2nd. One of the local home guardsmen, Henry Pendleton, later recalled, quote, "At last we heard them moving with all the noise of the cavalry command. Our little force of volunteers had increased to 65 men and boys. We were restless, anxious, nervous. Nearer and nearer they came. We were not to fire until the head of the column should reach our barricade. To us it was a moment of fearful suspense, but every man at present stood at his post, ready to do his duty."
Dahlgren was riding at the head of the column with 2 other men. Alerted by some noise in the darkness, Uli told the others to see what lay ahead, but then enemy muzzle flashes lit the night.
Hit multiple times, Ulrich Dahlgren toppled from the saddle. Falling face down in the mud of the roadside ditch, he was dead, a month and a day before his 22nd birthday.
The Confederate volley killed Ulrich Dahlgren instantly, but his men didn't realize it in the inky darkness of the winter night. The rebels immediately captured many of the disoriented Federals, and the rest surrendered the next morning. And so, instead of reducing the number of prisoners being held at Belle Isle and Libby Prison, Dahlgren's command instead swelled the ranks of those already overcrowded places.
One of the boys accompanying the Confederate Home Guardsmen, 13-year-old William Littlepage from nearby Stevensville, was searching the ambush site for souvenirs when he came upon Dahlgren's body. Besides a gold watch and cigar case, he also found a notebook and some folded papers. When he gave the notebook and papers to his schoolmaster, Edward Hallback, Littlepage said that the dead Yankee had a wooden leg. Overhearing this, one of the Confederates who'd been held prisoner by the Federals told the ambushers, "There, you have killed Colonel Dahlgren, who was in command of the enemy."
When Hallback scanned the papers found by young Littlepage, he discovered they spelled out a plan for Dahlgren's column to dash into Richmond, burn the city, free the POWs, capture Jefferson Davis and his cabinet, assassinate them, and then free the local slaves so that they could wreak havoc on their former masters.
Appalled by what he read, Hallback turned the papers over to Lieutenant Pollard, who took them to the 9th Virginia Cavalry's commanding officer, Colonel Richard Beale, who instructed Pollard to take them to Wade Hampton, or, if Hampton couldn't be found, to another of the Confederate cavalry generals, Robert E. Lee's nephew, Major General Fitzhugh Lee. Well, Pollard delivered the documents to Fitz Lee, who immediately took them to Richmond and delivered them personally to Jefferson Davis.
When Fitz Lee gave the documents to Jefferson Davis, the Confederate Secretary of State, Judah Benjamin, was with him. Quote, "Admitted to his private office, I found no one but Mr. Benjamin with him. The papers were handed to him, and he read them aloud in our presence, making no comment save a laughing remark when he came to the sentence, 'Jeff Davis and Cabinet must be killed on the spot.' Fitz Lee recalled that Davis said, 'That means you, Mr. Benjamin.'"
Lee then took the papers to the office of General Samuel Cooper, the Adjutant General of the Confederate Army. Cooper eventually released the contents of the documents to the Richmond newspapers, which reproduced them verbatim. All of them were written in Dahlgren's handwriting on official 3rd Cavalry Division stationery. Among the instructions he wrote for his men were to release the prisoners on Belle Isle, and then the Federal cavalrymen were to, quote, "destroy and burn the hateful city," end quote. Also, quote, "do not allow the rebel leader Davis and his traitorous crew to escape."
A second document written on the same stationery was titled Special Orders, in which Dahlgren again specified the destruction of Richmond, quote, "the bridges will be burned and the city destroyed," end quote. The orders also spelled out the decapitation of the Confederate government, quote, "the men must keep together and well in hand, and once in the city it must be destroyed, and Jeff Davis and Cabinet killed."
He also prepared an itinerary for the raid on a 3rd sheet of the official stationery. Finally, Dahlgren's pocket notebook was filled with notes and comments. It indicated that once captured, Davis and his cabinet, quote, "must be killed on the spot." It also included a draft of a speech to the men in his column that included the lines, "You must encourage the prisoners to destroy the city. Make one vast flame of it."
When these documents were made public in the Richmond newspapers, a huge controversy erupted that continues to rage to this day. The Richmond Whig proclaimed that, quote, "henceforth the name of Dahlgren is linked with eternal infamy." After describing the content of the documents, the editor of the Richmond Daily Dispatch wrote, "Let us redouble our energies and our vigilance to guard against the schemes and plots of a foe who has proved himself to be the most unscrupulous, as he is the most brutal and fiend-like that ever made war on a people."
The Richmond newspapers labeled him Ulrich the Hun. Some of the editorials even called for the immediate execution of Dahlgren's captured men as punishment for their participation in such a dastardly scheme. And in fact, Jefferson Davis and his cabinet discussed that very subject. Secretary of War James Seddon was the most vocal supporter of the execution of the prisoners. He was supported by Davis's military advisor, General Braxton Bragg. However, Jefferson Davis balked. He suggested they seek Robert E. Lee's viewpoint, and that Lee's opinion should decide the matter.
Fortunately, Robert E. Lee selected a wise and careful course. He agreed that the document should be published, quote, "and the world should know the character of the war our enemies wage against us, and the unchristian and atrocious acts they plot and perpetrate. But I cannot recommend the execution of the prisoners that have fallen into our hands."
Lee's wise counsel ended any further discussion of executing the prisoners. But on March 30th, Samuel Cooper did convey Davis's wishes that Lee communicate with George Meade to determine if the plan set forth in the Dahlgren Papers had in fact been sanctioned by the Union High Command. The next day, Lee did so, opening an extraordinary correspondence. Lee included photographs of the actual documents and concluded his letter by writing, quote, "In obedience to my instructions, I beg leave respectfully to inquire whether the designs of Colonel Dahlgren, as set forth in these papers, were authorized by the United States government or by his superior officers, and also whether they have the sanction and approval of those authorities."
The letter was passed across the lines under a flag of truce. On April 17th, Meade responded to Lee, writing, "In reply, I have to state that neither the United States government, myself, nor General Kilpatrick authorized, sanctioned, or approved the burning of the city of Richmond and the killing of Mr. Davis and cabinet, nor any other act not required by military necessity and in accordance with the usages of war."
As support for his denial, Meade included a letter by Judson Kilpatrick. In it, Kilpatrick says he interviewed some of the officers and men who accompanied Dahlgren's column, and they all said they knew nothing of any of the instructions contained in the documents, quote, "alleged to have been found upon the person of Colonel Dahlgren," end quote. Well, Kilpatrick's use of the word alleged was deliberate, as he then went on to imply the documents, or at least a portion of them, were forged. He concluded by stating, quote, "Colonel Dahlgren received no orders from me to pillage, burn, or kill, nor were any such instructions given me by my superiors."
And with that, the United States Army disavowed Ulrich Dahlgren. However, throwing the young officer under the bus didn't sit well with George Meade, and he told a member of his staff that he considered the weight of evidence favored the authenticity of the documents, and that he didn't consider Kilpatrick trustworthy.
In a letter to his wife, Meade admitted, quote, "This was a pretty ugly piece of business, for in denying having authorized or approved the burning of Richmond or killing Mr. Davis and cabinet, I necessarily threw odium on Dahlgren. I, however, enclosed a letter from Kilpatrick in which the authenticity of the papers was impugned. But I regret to say Kilpatrick's reputation and collateral evidence in my possession rather go against this theory. However, I was determined my skirts should be cleared, so I promptly disavowed having ever authorized, sanctioned, or approved of any act not required by military necessity and in accordance with the usages of war."
The official federal denial, although politically necessary and expedient, didn't ring true to outraged Confederate citizens. Mary Chesnut kept a diary filled with her many pithy observations of life and especially of politics in Richmond. She wrote disdainfully, quote, "Now that Dahlgren has failed to carry out his orders, the Yankees disown them. They disavow it all. He was not sent here to murder us all, hang the president, and burn the town. There is the notebook, however, with the orders to hang and burn.
Despite the official disavowal, Uli's death deeply grieved many throughout the North. The Philadelphia Inquirer, Ulrich's hometown newspaper, called him a hero and also described him as, quote, one of the bravest sons of America, and his death will be regretted by all who knew him.
Abraham Lincoln's personal secretary, John Hay, who was one of Uli's favorite companions for a night out in Washington, was in Florida when he received the news. He wrote in his diary, quote, I was shocked at hearing today of Ulrich Dahlgren's death. A great future cut off and a good fellow gone.
Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles wrote in his diary, a more gallant and brave-hearted fellow was not to be found in the service. His death will be a terrible blow to his father, who doted on him. Wells' observation that Uli's death would be a terrible blow to Admiral Dahlgren was correct. John Dahlgren learned of the expedition on the day Uli died. He went home to Washington from South Carolina for a few days and was surprised to find his son had gone on a mission. That night he noted in his diary, Uli is away with General Kilpatrick, which I regret, for his crippled leg is not well.
2 days later, on March 4th, the president sent Dahlgren a note informing him that his son was missing in action. By the 7th, the admiral was nearly frantic with worry. He wrote in his diary, no tidings today of Uli, nothing from the president, who would, of course, send me word. Oh, how I wish this painful anxiety were at an end.
The next day, Lincoln sent Dahlgren word that Uli was dead. The admiral boarded his steamer and sailed for Fortress Monroe, where Benjamin Butler handed him a package of Richmond papers, which confirmed the news of Ulrich's death. Judson Kilpatrick came to see the grieving father. According to Dahlgren, Kilpatrick spoke in, quote, unbounded terms of my dear son, who seemed as usual to have been the very soul of the operation.
Dahlgren said Kilpatrick addressed the aspect of Ulrich's death that bothered him the most, that is, the reports of the contents of the documents found on his body. According to the admiral, Kilpatrick, quote, said it was basely false that his orders contained anything of killing Davis or burning the city.
Dahlgren's grief was deepened by the fact he couldn't even retrieve his son's body to give it a proper burial. You see, so great was the public's anger over the documents found on Ulrich's body that the Confederate authorities had his remains buried in an unmarked grave in a Richmond cemetery late at night to protect the corpse from being dug up and desecrated. However, when they decided to go ahead and return his son's body to Admiral Dahlgren, the Confederates were shocked to find that Ulrich's corpse was missing from its secret grave.
What happened is that Elizabeth Van Lew, the female spy master living in Richmond, whom we mentioned in the last episode, managed to discover the location of the unmarked grave and had Ulrich's body disinterred and transported to a farm in the countryside owned by a trusted Union man, where it was reburied in a hidden grave.
On April 14th, the Richmond Examiner newspaper reported that the Confederates had opened Uli's grave, quote, under the direction of the officials who interred the remains, but the grave was empty. Dahlgren had risen, or been resurrected, and the corpse was not found. End quote. Well, for the rebels, the astonishing disappearance of the body added yet another layer of sensationalism to the story of the Dahlgren papers. In any case, Elizabeth Van Lew got word to Benjamin Butler at Fortress Monroe regarding the successful mission to steal and then hide Uli's body, and on April 20th, Butler sent a message to the admiral telling him, I have reliable information from Richmond that Colonel Dahlgren's body has been taken possession of by his Union friends and has been put beyond the reach of the rebel authorities.
Knowing that his son's remains were safe, Dahlgren prepared to return to duty in South Carolina, but first he arranged for a memorial service to be held in Washington. The service was held at Washington's First Presbyterian Church on April 24th and was attended by many dignitaries, including President Lincoln and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton.
A year later, a week or so after the fall of Richmond, on April 2nd, 1865, Uli's remains were recovered from their hiding place and transported to Washington. The funeral had to wait until the admiral could leave his duty station at Charleston, and so the service didn't take place until November 1st. The funeral was attended by President Andrew Johnson and his entire cabinet, after which burial took place at Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia. And thus, Ulrich Dahlgren's final adventure at last came to an end, a year and a half after he was killed on that dark, muddy road in Virginia. But the controversy over the documents he carried that night continued to boil and fester long after Uli was laid to rest.
Not content with finally laying his son's body to rest, John Dahlgren was determined to clear Uli's good name and reputation, and he launched a vigorous campaign to dispute the validity of the documents found on his son's body.
John Dahlgren spent the rest of his life claiming the documents were forgeries. His argument rested on his examination of the photographic reproductions of the papers taken by the Confederates. He noticed that the signature read U. Dahlgren, with the last name misspelled, with the L and H transposed or switched.
The New York Times published a lengthy letter penned by the admiral in which he spelled out his arguments as to why the Dahlgren papers were forgeries and could not be authentic documents. John Dahlgren died in 1870, and he went to his grave fiercely defending his son's reputation and condemning the documents as fakes.
The controversy over the authenticity of the Dahlgren papers continued to rage over the years and continues today. The photographs of the documents, the ones sent to George Meade by Robert E. Lee, can be found in the National Archives today. The original papers themselves fell into federal hands in May 1865 after the fall of Richmond. Dr. Francis Lieber, head of a bureau in the office of the Adjutant General, took custody of the documents for eventual inclusion in the National Archives. However, in November of 1865, Edwin Stanton ordered Dr. Lieber to turn the Dahlgren papers over to him. Lieber did so on December 1st, after which the documents disappeared. It is, of course, pure speculation as to what might have happened to them. All that can be said for certain is that they disappeared after being given to the Secretary of War. However, if you'd like to conclude that the documents likely ended up in Stanton's fireplace, well, you won't get much pushback from us.
In any case, as we said, John Dahlgren vigorously disputed the authenticity of the papers until the end of his life. He attacked their authenticity on two main grounds. First, that his son always signed his correspondence by writing out his whole name and did not use the abbreviation U. Dahlgren. And second, that the last name was misspelled.
As a result of his impassioned defense of his son's honor, other contemporary refutations followed, and then down through the years, the question of the authenticity of the documents and the controversy persisted. However, the principal assertion upon which John Dahlgren based his argument has been addressed and dismissed. You see, back in 1879, ex-Confederate General Jubal Early, who was intrigued by the controversy, had a photographic copy of the documents, and upon examination, he realized that the paper upon which they were originally written had been so thin that the writing on one side of the page could plainly be seen from the reverse side. In fact, if he used a mirror, early discovered that he could read the reverse writing. He realized the tail of the letter Y and the word destroying on the first page came through at the right point and right angle to make it appear that the letter L came before the letter H in the signature on the reverse side, thus making it appear the name Dahlgren had been misspelled.
In 1958, a historian named Virgil Carrington Jones engaged the services of a police handwriting expert who confirmed Jubal Early's observation, and the expert also addressed the issue of forgery, concluding there was nothing in the documents to indicate they had been forged.
Many have also pointed out that the chain of custody, while the documents were in Confederate hands, appears complete and unbroken. All the people who had actual possession of the documents vouched for the accuracy of what the Richmond papers reported. Their testimony also demonstrates there was little, if any, time or opportunity for someone to tamper or otherwise modify the documents. It appears, therefore, that the Dahlgren papers were, in fact, authentic. However, that conclusion raises yet more questions. Can the scandalous orders spelled out in the documents be attributed simply to the overexuberance and lack of wisdom of a young officer who, had the directives been carried out, would have been acting entirely on his own initiative? Or were the orders to burn Richmond and kill Jefferson Davis evidence of a conspiracy that included, at the least, Judson Kilpatrick, and perhaps even Secretary of War Edwin Stanton? Unfortunately, the truth of the matter will likely never be known, and the answer to the question of what was behind the Dahlgren papers will forever be a mystery lost to the ages.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is Cavalry Raids of the Civil War by Robert W. Black.
You can find a list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org. Also at the website, you can find information on joining the Strawfoot Brigade and supporting the podcast in that way, just like Evan E., Ted J., and Miranda have done recently.
Just a reminder as we wrap up this show that the music you hear at the start and at the end of every episode is from the song Midnight on the Water by Spiritwood Music, and we use it with their kind permission.
Thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Tracy and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.